So I want you to picture an egg. Just, a standard everyday egg sitting right there on your kitchen counter.
Okay, I'm with you. Just a normal egg.
Right. So you have the yolk suspended in the middle, you have the egg white surrounding it, and then gripping that entire structure in this, airtight, unyielding embrace is the shell.
Yeah, totally encasing it.
Exactly. It completely encases what is inside. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. It's basically nature's perfect isolation chamber, designed to keep that internal environment completely static.
Which is funny because, the structural integrity of an eggshell is actually this marvel of engineering. The dome shape distributes pressure perfectly, making it incredibly resilient to external force.
Right.
But that strength, it comes at the cost of total permeability. The inside is entirely, totally cut off from the reality of the outside environment.
And see, that's the thing.
Ugh.
When we usually talk about a leader or a government that is, out of touch with reality, the default metaphor we all use is a bubble.
Oh, yeah. Like they're living in a bubble.
Exactly. We say a politician is living in a bubble, or a CEO is isolated in this corporate bubble. But as we look at Allama Parvez's analysis of Surah 41 of the Quran today, he just bypasses that fragile metaphor entirely.
He really does.
He pulls this analogy from the Arabic text that is, honestly, structurally terrifying.
Yeah.
He points to the linguistic roots describing corrupt leadership and notes that the text doesn't describe a bubble at all. It describes this calcified, impenetrable eggshell.
Because a bubble implies fragility.
Right.
A bubble is something that a single pinprick of truth can just instantly destroy.
Pop, and it's gone.
Exactly. The moment a harsh reality touches a bubble, it pops, and the person inside is suddenly forced to confront the outside world. But an eggshell is fundamentally different.
It's a fortress.
Yes, it is a fortress. It is designed specifically to ensure that external reality cannot penetrate. What Parvez extracts from this 7th century text is a pure, unadulterated sociological law regarding how human power structures naturally behave.
Right.
They don't merely become isolated by accident, They actively build a calcified shell around themselves.
And the mechanism of how that shell is built is what makes his analysis so incredibly grounded. When I was reviewing his translation of this concept, the realization hit me that this is not a critique of personal morality.
No, not at all.
We are not talking about some inherently evil monarch sitting on a throne, twirling a mustache, deciding to just ignore the peasants. We are talking about the inevitable physics of centralized power.
The structural physics.
Parvez argues the Quran lays out this structural mechanism where powerful figures become helplessly encased by their own inner circle. The sycophants, the flatterers, the specialized advisors, they attach themselves to the center of power and effectively just fuse together to form that shell.
And the TIS uses a very specific linguistic concept here to describe these companions, right? These inner circle elites. Their primary function in this structural model is not to advise or to govern. Their entire job description is to take the disastrous, exploitative decisions of the leader and make them look beautiful.
That's such a wild concept. They're just PR filters.
Essentially, yeah. They are filters, but they only filter in one direction. They block out the cries of the populace, the warning signs of economic collapse, the rational critiques of policy, and they project inward a continuous affirmation of the leader's brilliance.
You can map this directly onto a modern corporate boardroom or like a contemporary political administration.
Oh, effortlessly.
Just imagine a CEO who is about to make a decision that will hollow out their company's manufacturing base. They're going to lay off 10,000 workers and essentially tank the company's long-term viability just for a short-term stock bump.
Right, a classic move.
Sitting around that mahogany table are 12 executive vice presidents. And every single one of their livelihoods, their stock options, their social prestige, it all depends entirely on maintaining proximity to that CEO's favor.
So in that environment, presenting the grim reality of the factory floor is basically career suicide.
Yeah, you'd be fired instantly.
Exactly. The executives do not walk into the boardroom with photographs of devastated industrial towns or, data showing long-term structural collapse.
What do they bring?
They walk in with a slide deck. A meticulously designed, color-coordinated presentation that frames the mass layoffs as a strategic synergistal optimization.
Wow.
They take a fundamentally destructive action and, structurally fulfilling the exact role Parvez outlines, they make it beautiful.
And because of this encasing, the leader actually becomes totally blind and deaf to reality. Outside the glass walls of that boardroom, the supply chain could be fracturing.
The workers could be organizing strikes.
The consumer base could be fleeing. But inside the eggshell, the climate control is perfect.
The lighting is soft.
Yeah, everyone is nodding in unison. The leader looks around and sees absolute consensus.
And this highlights the core tragedy of the authoritarian or monopolistic mindset. The person at the absolute pinnacle of the power structure genuinely believes they are making rational, informed choices based on the data they have.
But they don't control the data.
No, the shell controls the data. The inner circle intercepts any external rational voice before it can even penetrate the membrane.
Right.
The leader becomes a prisoner of their own prestige, entirely dependent on the sensory organs of the sycophants surrounding them.
And you, as the listener, can likely identify this exact dynamic in your own workplace or your local city council or the national political parties you observe.
It's everywhere.
The person who seemingly holds all the levers of power is often the most trapped individual in the entire organizational chart. They are completely insulated from the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
And Parwez, he just strips away any mystical interpretations of these verses and applies this rigid sociological lens. This is how human societies organize themselves when power becomes centralized and unaccountable.
But here's the thing. This structural isolation inevitably creates a massive vulnerability for the establishment.
How so?
Oh, well, the eggshell is phenomenally effective at keeping the leader isolated from the truth, right? But it does absolutely nothing to stop the masses from experiencing that truth.
Oh, right. Because the workers still feel the layoffs.
Exactly. The citizens still feel the inflation. If a rational alternative like a message demanding economic justice or systemic structural change starts gaining traction out in the streets, the establishment faces a crisis.
Right. They can't just ignore it forever.
Because while the leader is safe inside the shell, the foundation of the society outside is cracking.
So the power structure has to shift gears then, from passive isolation to active neutralization. How does a fundamentally irrational, insulated power structure handle a rational threat from the outside?
Well, they definitely do not engage in debate.
No, of course not. They don't invite the dissenting voice into a public forum to have a rigorous intellectual discourse on the merits of the economic system.
That would legitimize them.
Right. So looking at verse 26 in Parwez's analysis, he extracts this concept of law.
Yes, law, which translates to meaningless noise, frivolity, absurdity.
He translates the establishment's stated tactic from the ancient text, and it outlines a highly sophisticated method of censorship. It's basically, do not listen to this rational message, and when it is spoken, just make noise so you can overcome it.
Yeah.
And he illustrates this using the Urdu phrase, Cain, Cain.
Which is such a brilliant visualization. Cain mimics the chaotic, relentless squawking of crows.
Right.
Imagine a massive flock of birds descending on a square and just screaming over everything else. There is no melody, there is no message, there's just sheer, overwhelming volume.
The tactic is not to formulate a counter-argument at all.
Yeah.
The tactic is to completely overwhelm the bandwidth of the society.
Yes.
Because we typically conceptualize censorship through like a 20th century authoritarian lens.
Wow.
We picture a dictator burning books or putting black tape over a dissident's mouth or shutting down a printing press.
But that is an incredibly inefficient, primitive way to censor people in a complex, interconnected society.
Right. Because why?
It's inefficient because human psychology naturally resists a vacuum. If you ban a book, you instantly turn it into a forbidden artifact.
Oh, totally. It becomes cool.
You turn the silenced author into a martyr. You draw immense public curiosity to the very secret you are trying to hide. People inherently want to uncover what the power structure is afraid of.
Yeah.
So the 20th century model of silence backfires by validating the threat of the dissenting voice.
But flooding the zone with kin and cane solves that problem perfectly. If you orchestrate a cacophony so loud, so pervasive, and so completely meaningless, the rational alternative is not banned. It's just swallowed whole.
Exactly.
You don't need to burn the book if you can bury it under a billion pages of absolute garbage.
The establishment weaponizes mass communication to deafen, not to argue. The sheer volume of triviality becomes the ultimate mechanism of systemic control.
And this maps flawlessly onto the architecture of modern algorithmic feeds. Think about the experience of opening a smartphone today.
It's overwhelming.
You might open a browser actively looking for a serious, grounded analysis of systemic economic issues. You want to understand, the mechanics of why housing prices have entirely decoupled from median wages over the last 40 years.
Right, a real structural question.
But the algorithm, which is the modern distribution engine of the establishment, it does not feed you that structural critique.
No, it feeds you fabricated outrage over a celebrity's wardrobe.
Yes. Or it feeds you a hyper-edited viral dance challenge. Or a 20-second clip of a politician misspeaking, just looped and remixed for maximum engagement.
And the algorithm is the perfect modern analog because it targets the modern equivalents of the demographic divides Parwez identifies in the text.
Oh, this is fascinating. Walk us through that.
Well, this isn't just a scattershot approach, right? The Keynkeyn is tailored. Parwez re-examines two words in the text that are traditionally heavily mystified, jinn and ins.
Right, because traditionally when people hear the word jinn, the immediate association is supernatural.
Genies, basically.
Yeah, spirits made of smokeless fire operating in some parallel dimension. It is a concept heavily laden with folklore. But Parwez applies a strict socioeconomic and linguistic lens to strip that away entirely.
He really grounds it.
Looking at his notes, he points out that in the root Arabic, ins refers to that which is visible. In the sociological context of ancient Arabia, ins referred to the familiar, socialized people.
The urban dwellers living in the settled cities, the merchants in Mecca.
Exactly. And conversely, the root of jinn.
It implies that which is hidden or concealed from the eye. Historically and sociologically, Parwez argues this referred to the nomadic tribes, the rural populations, the Bedouins who lived outside the visible structured walls of the city.
Right.
You did not see them in the daily commerce of the town square, right? They were out of sight, hidden in the vastness of the desert landscape.
So he is outlining the fundamental rural-urban divide, the visible city folks and the hidden country folks.
The blue-collar agricultural or nomadic worker versus the white-collar urban merchant.
And the establishment's brilliance is recognizing that these two distinct demographics require completely different frequencies of noise.
Exactly. The mechanism of propaganda is deployed across all demographic divides, but it is customized.
How so?
Well, the urban elites, the Indans, might receive a specific brand of algorithmic squawking tailored to their cosmopolitan anxieties, debates about high society status, urban fashion, or elite political theater.
Oh, I see.
Meanwhile, the rural or hidden populations, the jinn, they receive their own tailored frequency of noise, perhaps hyper-focused on different cultural wedge issues or regional grievances.
The flavors of the noise are different, but the sociological result is absolutely identical. Both the visible urbanite and the hidden nomad are prevented from hearing the rational structural critique.
They're both deafened.
Both groups are kept agitated, distracted, and entirely subjugated by the people sitting safely inside the eggshell. The sheer volume of meaningless content distracts the entire populace from the structural realities of their own economic subjugation. The lone, rational voice, trying to point out that the economic system itself is rigged, becomes nothing more than a whisper in a hurricane.
So the overarching question this leads to is one of motivation. Why does the establishment need to expend such vast amounts of energy orchestrating this national flock of squawking crows?
Right, what's the point?
What is the power structure so terrified of that they must maintain a 247 infrastructure of distraction?
They are protecting a monopoly.
Yeah.
And we are not talking about a spiritual or theological monopoly here. They are protecting a raw material economic monopoly over the society's resources.
Yeah.
To ground this in how this structural defense mechanism operates in reality, we have to look at the historical case study Parwez uses in his lectures.
Right, the Raj debate.
Yes. He brings up the intense debate within Islamic jurisprudence over Raj, which is the penalty of zoning.
And just to clarify for you listening, we are analyzing this purely as a historical illustration of power dynamics and information control.
Exactly.
We are impartially observing Parwez's clash with the establishment. We're not endorsing a specific theological stance.
Absolutely. But it serves as a flawless mechanical case study of the eggshell and the noise operating in tandem to crush a structural threat.
It really does. The mechanics of the debate are vital to understand here. Parwez and a few others offered a highly rational, evidence-based critique of an established legal norm.
Their hermeneutical argument was straightforward.
Yes.
Yes.
They pointed directly to the text of the Quran, specifically Surah An-Nur, and noted that the text explicitly prescribes a penalty of lashes for adultery.
Right.
Parr argued that there is absolutely no mention of stoning in the Quranic text itself.
Right.
The establishment, however, relied on extra-Quranic traditions and historical precedents to mandate the harsher punishment of stoning. So Parr highlighted this contradiction, offering a rational textual challenge to a deeply entrenched practice.
And the establishment's reaction is the crucial data point for our deep dive today. If the power structure were operating rationally, they would invite Parwez to present his textual evidence.
They would host a public forum.
Yeah, they'd engage with the linguistics of his argument and debate the hermeneutics of Surah An-Nur versus the extra-Quranic texts. They would attempt to win on the battlefield of logic.
But they didn't do that at all.
Not even close.
Parr observed that the establishment utilized their ultimate built-in broadcasting tool, the Friday sermon.
Oh, wow.
Without engaging the substance of his textual argument whatsoever, they deployed a synchronized message across virtually every mosque in the country. It was a massive, coordinated campaign of denunciation. They flooded the zone.
It was the deployment of law scaled up to a national infrastructure.
Exactly.
When thousands of loudspeakers across an entire nation are screaming the exact same denunciation at the exact same time, the lone voice holding up a text and asking for a logical debate is instantaneously drowned out.
The asymmetrical power of the noise is just staggering. The establishment did not need to hire a PR firm or build a new media network.
It was already there.
The infrastructure of noise was already woven into the fabric of the society. They just flipped a switch, and the echo chamber deafened the populace.
But the intensity of their reaction reveals their vulnerability, doesn't it? Why react with such overwhelming, coordinated force just to crush a debate about the reading of a text?
Because the text is merely the surface layer. The establishment understands the mechanics of authority better than anyone.
Right.
If they allow the populace to rationally question their interpretation on point A, the populace will inevitably develop the critical framework to question them on point B.
And what is point B?
Point B is the control of the economy. The ultimate goal of the establishment, as Parr extracts from these verses, is to maintain their status as the rab.
Okay, we need to unpack that because the redefinition of the word rab is the crux of this entire sociological framework.
It really is.
If you open a standard English translation of the text, Rabs is almost universally translated as Lord.
Yeah.
It carries this ethereal, floating in the clouds, purely spiritual connotation. It evokes the image of a deity you pray to in quiet moments of reflection.
But Parr forcefully pulls that word out of the clouds and grounds it in hard socioeconomics.
Yeah, he completely reframes it.
In the Quranic context, he argues, Rab does not merely signify a spiritual deity. It means the provider of sustenance.
Okay.
It is the entity that guarantees your roti, your daily bread. It is the power structure that controls the means of production, the agricultural yield, the distribution of wealth, what he terms the nishonuma.
Nishonuma.
Yeah, the developmental resources required for a society to function and grow.
So when the establishment deploys a national campaign of noise to protect their authority, they are not merely defending abstract religious dogma.
No.
They are defending their absolute monopoly over the economy. They are defending their status as the provider of sustenance.
And you can look at the historical example of Pharaoh that Parr continuously references. In the narrative, Pharaoh stands before his people and famously declares, "I am your highest rab."
Right, and traditionally, we interpret this as pure theological arrogance. We assume Pharaoh was suffering from a god complex, demanding supernatural worship from his subjects.
But applying Parwez's economic lens, Pharaoh's claim was deeply pragmatic and terrifyingly material.
How so?
He wasn't just demanding spiritual submission. He was making a brutal economic assertion. He was looking at his society and saying, I own the River Nile. I own the irrigation canals that water the crops.
I own the agricultural yield.
Exactly. I control the grain silos that store the harvest. I am your rab, because if you do not submit to my societal structure, I will cut off your access to the means of production, and you will starve in the desert.
It is the ultimate manifestation of monopoly. Existing social orders, whether you are analyzing ancient Egyptian dynastic rule, feudal European monarchies, or modern hyper-consolidated corporate structures, they all rely entirely on engineering a system where the masses are economically dependent.
Precisely.
If the populace relies on the establishment for their sheer survival, the establishment has successfully cemented its status as the rab.
And this reframes the entire discussion we've been having. The calcified eggshell, the army of sycophants, the relentless barrage of meaningless algorithmic or rhetorical noise, it is all a highly coordinated defense mechanism.
Yeah, it all serves the same goal.
The entire apparatus exists to ensure the masses never achieve the clarity to realize they can bypass the human overlords and access the resources of the earth directly.
Right.
The establishment requires you to believe that without their management, without their trickle-down benevolence, you will not survive.
So a rational alternative is basically an existential threat to that bottom line. If a voice breaks through the noise and demonstrates that the text actually outlines a system of economic justice, a system where resources are distributed equitably, where no single human being holds a monopoly over another human being's access to food and shelter, that voice must be crushed.
Because if the people hear it, the illusion shatters. The populace realizes the human Rab is obsolete.
So if we are analyzing a society built on this foundation of noise, illusion, and economic subjugation, how does Parwez interpret the text's rational mechanism for breaking out of it? How does a society dismantle the monopoly?
Well, the text outlines a highly specific sequential solution. It begins with the foundational declaration. Our Rab is Allah.
Okay.
But crucially, that declaration must be immediately followed by the action of Istaqamu, which translates to standing firm, to maintaining an unwavering trajectory despite immense resistance.
And we really have to actively deconstruct the traditional view of the phrase, our Rabb is Allah, because, frankly, it has been domesticated.
Oh, completely domesticated.
It is arguably one of the most repeated phrases globally. People chant it in the mornings, they use it as a passive spiritual affirmation, they weave it into beautiful calligraphy to hang in their living rooms. It feels like a comforting way of saying the universe is in control.
But Parwez strips away that passivity. In its original structural context, declaring our Rab is Allah was not a quiet morning meditation.
No.
It was a radical, public, socio-economic declaration of independence.
If we plug in Parwez's definition of Rab as the controller of the means of production, the implications are explosive.
Utterly explosive.
Standing up in the middle of Pharaoh's Egypt, or standing up in a society ruled by a corrupt tribal oligarchy and declaring Allah as our only Rab is an act of supreme defiance.
You are looking directly at the human overlords, the kings, the politicians, the monopolists, the billionaires, and you are actively stripping them of their legitimacy.
Right.
You are saying, you do not own the earth, you do not own the water, you do not own the rights to my livelihood, I deny your monopoly.
That is not a prayer. That is treason against the establishment. You are rejecting the fundamental premise of the existing economic hierarchy.
Which is precisely why Parwez emphasizes that the declaration is practically meaningless, even suicidal, without Istaqamu standing firm.
Yeah, because the pushback is going to be massive.
Exactly. The moment a group of people declares economic independence, the moment they verbally strip the establishment of its status as Rab, the power structure will retaliate with maximum force.
They have to.
The eggshell will crack open just enough to unleash the military, economic, and social wrath of the elites.
They will amplify the noise, they will organize embargoes, they will cut off supply lines, and they will utilize every tool of state violence to crush the rebellion and make an example of the dissenters.
So to declare our Rab is Allah is to knowingly invite the full, unmitigated hostility of the existing power structure.
Right.
The critical historical and sociological question then becomes, how does a fledgling rational movement survive that inevitable backlash?
Yeah, how do they not just get crushed?
This is where we encounter Parwez's most intensely debated rational reinterpretation of the text. He looks at the concept of the descent of angels, the Malaika.
Okay, I have to pause here because this requires serious pushback.
Sure.
We have been meticulously building a socioeconomic framework, right? We are discussing structural laws of society, means of production, and economic monopolies. And now we are introducing angels.
I know, it sounds like a pivot.
By definition, across centuries of theology, angels are supernatural entities. They're beings with wings descending from the heavens.
Right.
If we reduce angels to a purely rational sociological mechanism, aren't we just projecting a 20th century post-Enlightenment rationalism onto a 7th century text that was fundamentally understood as mystical by its original audience? I mean, why did the traditional supernatural view hold so firmly for over a millennium if the text was just talking about sociology?
It's the most vital critique of Parwez's methodology, honestly.
Yeah.
The traditional view held firmly because the historical events the text addresses, specifically the early battles like Badr and Uhud, were so statistically improbable that supernatural intervention seemed the only logical explanation for the outcome.
The odds were insane.
Right. At the Battle of Badr, you had roughly 313 poorly equipped, starving individuals facing a heavily armed professional military force of over 1,000. The rational mind of the era concluded that literal angels riding white horses must have physically swung swords to secure the victory.
Because survival against those odds defies standard military logic.
Precisely. But Parwez defends his rational framework by pointing to the text's own explanation of what the Malaika actually did.
Okay, what does the text say?
The text does not say the angels inflicted physical casualties. It explicitly states that the descent of these forces was designed to alter the human psychological state.
Interesting.
Parwez argues that the Malaika represent immense, unbreakable psychological fortitude. They are not physical entities. They are internal states of being that act as a force multiplier.
So the early Muslims fought the battle themselves, swinging their own swords, but they did so armed with an internal psychological state that made them virtually invincible against a superior force.
Yes. The text identifies two specific psychological crippling agents that the Malaika remove from the human mind: kuf and huz.
Okay, let's break those down. Looking at the mechanics of those words, ku clearly aligns with the fear of external threats.
Yeah.
It is the paralyzing anxiety regarding the future. If you are standing in a dusty field with 300 farmers holding makeshift weapons against 1,000 armored soldiers, Kuf is the voice in your head screaming, "We are going to be slaughtered. We are going to lose our families. We are going to be erased from history."
Exactly.
And in a modern context, if you are a small labor union attempting to strike against a multinational conglomerate, Kuf is the terror of losing your health insurance, being blacklisted, and facing financial ruin. It is the terror of the establishment's guaranteed retaliation.
That's a perfect modern equivalent. And
Yeah.
huzn.
Husn appears to be the internal anger. It is grief. It is depression over what has already been lost.
Yeah.
It is the trauma of the past. It's the exhausting realization of, we have been persecuted for years. We have lost our homes. We have suffered endlessly. And the struggle is just too massive.
And the combination of kuf and huzn is what destroys rebellions.
Always.
Why do rational movements against corrupt systems typically fail? It is almost never because their structural arguments are incorrect.
Right.
They fail because human beings have psychological limits. The people simply get tired. They are paralyzed by the fear of future consequences, kuf, or they are hollowed out by the depression and burnout of the constant struggle, huzn.
Yeah, they just burn out.
The establishment relies on the strategy of attrition. They know they possess the capital to outlast you, outspend you, and outnoise you until your psychology breaks.
So Parwez is arguing that when a group of people make this radical declaration of economic independence, when they genuinely internalize that they only answer to a system of divine justice and not to human monopolists, the descent of angels is the sudden, overwhelming psychological clarity that allows them to achieve Istaqamu.
Yes, exactly.
It is the instantaneous evaporation of fear and the lifting of depression. They achieve a zero fear, zero grief state.
And that psychological state is the rational equivalent of a supernatural miracle.
It really is.
If an establishment faces a populace that is no longer afraid of poverty, no longer afraid of violence, and no longer exhausted by grief, the establishment has lost its primary levers of control.
Wow.
A populace armed with that unshakable psychological stability refuses to be intimidated by the power structure, and they refuse to be deafened by the Khan Kane.
So we have outlined the complete trajectory of the struggle here.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We started with the calcified eggshell of the corrupt elite, entirely deaf to the reality of the society they exploit. We analyzed the weaponized noise, the cane that they use to blind and divide the visible urbanites and the hidden rural populations. We identified their core motivation, protecting their monopoly over sustenance, their status as the human rab. And we examined the rational mechanism of rebellion, declaring independence from that monopoly and standing firm with absolute unbreakable psychological courage.
Which brings us to the final necessary phase of Parwez's analysis. What is the material reality of the society that emerges on the other side?
Right.
When the noise is finally silenced, when the human overlords are structurally removed, and this rational, just system is implemented, What does the daily life of a citizen actually look like?
The text describes a societal state that sounds remarkably utopian. It describes a system where people receive what they ask for, and crucially, they are provided for even regarding the internal desires they lack the imagination or the vocabulary to articulate.
Yeah.
It sounds beautiful, but we must interrogate the mechanics of it. How is this fundamentally different from a highly efficient, modern welfare state?
That is the ultimate test of the framework.
Because under a human overlords, a citizen might still receive material provision.
Sure.
A benevolent dictator or a deeply entrenched establishment might build state-of-the-art hospitals, distribute subsidized bread, or even provide a universal basic income. They provide sustenance to keep the masses quiet and functioning. So how does Parwez differentiate his Quranic rational structure from a well-managed, benevolent tyranny?
He differentiates it through the fundamental dynamic of human dignity. The material provision might look similar on a spreadsheet, right? But the sociological mechanics are totally opposed.
How so?
Parwez utilizes a very dark, vivid metaphor to illustrate the establishment's model of giving. He says that under a human overlord, you are provided for in the exact same manner a butcher feeds a goat.
Wow. Okay. The butcher ensures the goat receives the finest grain.
Yeah.
The butcher provides clean water and builds a sturdy shelter to keep the goat healthy.
But the provision is entirely extractive and, frankly, transactionally violent. The butcher is not feeding the goat out of respect for the goat's inherent dignity.
No, obviously not.
The butcher is feeding the goat solely to maximize its physical mass so that he can slaughter it and extract its value at a later date. The sustenance is provided, but it is structurally degrading. The goat possesses no inherent rights. It is merely an asset on the butcher's ledger.
That is a devastatingly precise analogy for the contemporary global economic system.
It is.
You receive your biweekly paycheck. Your corporation might provide you with wellness perks, gym memberships, and perhaps the government pauses your student loans during an election year.
Yeah.
But the underlying architecture is extractive. You're kept just healthy enough, just comfortable enough to ensure you wake up the next morning and continue generating capital for the executives insulated inside the eggshell. You are a biological resource.
It is a society built on exploitation masquerading as benevolence. But in the Quranic rational structure, Parwez extracts, the provision of sustenance operates on a completely different axis. It is not provided as a transaction. He quotes the text describing the provision as nuzulan min ghafur in rahim.
Okay, let's look at that.
It translates conceptually to being provided for as an honored guest.
We have to break down the linguistic roots of that phrase to understand how Parwez bridges it to the sociology of hospitality.
Yeah, please do.
Because ghafur is traditionally translated simply as forgiving, and rahim is translated as merciful, but the roots carry much deeper structural weight.
Exactly the right approach. The root of ghafur is ghafar, which fundamentally means to cover, to shield, or to protect.
Like armor.
Yes, it is the same root used for a helmet that protects a soldier's head in battle. And the root of rahim is ram, which is the Arabic word for the womb, an environment of absolute unconditional nourishment and growth that expects nothing in return from the life inside it.
So when the text says sustenance is provided, nuzulan min ghafur in rahim, it is describing a societal system that acts as an unconditional shield of protection and a womb of continuous nourishment.
Yes.
It is the absolute antithesis of the butcher and the goat.
And Parwez connects this linguistic reality to the profound pre-Islamic Arab tradition of the guest. To grasp the weight of being an honored guest in this context, you, as a modern listener, have to discard your current understanding of hospitality.
Right, because today having a guest means tidying up the living room and offering a beverage.
Exactly. But in the harsh, unforgiving environment of ancient Arabia, the concept of the guest was the highest, most sacrosanct law of survival.
It is a matter of literal life and death. If a traveler emerged from the desert and walked into your tent seeking refuge, the moment they crossed the threshold, they became your guest.
Yep.
And the moment that status was established, the host assumed absolute, total liability for their physical protection and sustenance.
The historical records of this code are just staggering. Parwez notes that the inviolability of the guest was so absolute that if a man sought refuge in a tent, and the host subsequently realized that this traveler was the very man who had murdered the host's own son,
Oh, wow.
The laws of hospitality still held supreme.
That's incredible.
The host was obligated to feed him, shelter him, and personally escort him safely to the borders of the territory before even entertaining the thought of seeking justice or vengeance.
Because the right of the guest superseded everything.
Exactly. The structural right of the guest superseded the deepest, most agonizing personal and family grievances.
Being a guest in that society was not an act of charity then.
Not at all.
It was not a favor. It was an ironclad structural right. And Parwes is extracting this exact sociological dynamic to describe the rational, just society.
Yeah.
The difference between a society managed by human overlords and a society operating on rational economic justice is basically the chasm between charity and dignity.
Spot on. In a society built on charity, the recipient constantly feels the humiliating weight of the favor.
Right.
To receive aid, you must perform your poverty. You must fill out forms proving you are desperate enough, broken enough, to deserve the crumbs falling from the establishment's table.
You have to prove you're worthy of survival.
Yes. You are forced to look down at your feet. You are the goat accepting a handful of grain from the butcher.
But in the rational economic system Parwes envisions, your material needs are met purely because you are a protected, dignified guest of the system itself. The societal structure is the host.
Yes.
You do not owe anyone a favor. You do not have to grovel to a politician for a subsidy or praise a billionaire philanthropist for a donation. The system is engineered to serve you with the absolute, unconditional respect a host grants an honored guest.
It represents the total eradication of the human rab. No individual is permitted to weaponize their wealth to lord over another, because the wealth of the society is structurally bound to serve everyone as guests.
Wow.
This is the material reality that manifests when the noise is silenced. This is what is built when the populace shatters the eggshell and maintains the psychological fortitude to stand firm. They transition from being exploitable livestock to being honored guests within an inherently just framework.
And that fundamental psychological shift from feeling like a burden who must justify their existence to feeling like a guest endowed with inherent structural rights, that is the environment that permanently removes Kof and Husin.
Exactly.
It is a total rewiring of how human beings relate to each other and to the resources of the earth.
Which, demands a deeply uncomfortable reflection on the architecture of our own modern lives. We must examine the mechanisms of our daily survival.
Absolutely.
Look at the sources of your economic security right now. When you evaluate your employment, your relationship with your government, your reliance on corporate infrastructure, are you operating as a protected guest in a just system with your humanity and dignity structurally guaranteed?
Or are you simply being fed by a system that expects to extract your labor, your data, and your value at a later date?
Right.
It fundamentally asks, are you the guest or are you the goat? And if you look closely at the structure of your life and realize you are not the guest, you have to identify the noise.
Yeah, the cane.
What is the daily algorithmic political cane that is constantly squawking at you, filling your bandwidth with outrage and triviality, desperately trying to drown out the rational truth that you deserve a life of inherent dignity? We invite you to take a hard, unblinking look at the eggshell you might be living beneath and consider the absolute psychological fortitude it would require to stand firm and finally crack it.